Our dummy application here is definitely missing some styling. This is totally ugly, and it's finally time to change this. Now, we do change styling by adding CSS, and we typically add CSS not by adding CSS tags in our HTML documents, though we could do that, but we typically add CSS files that hold our CSS code. Just as we might add JavaScript files for JavaScript logic or image files for adding images. But here it's about CSS. So all these files, CSS, JavaScript, images, are called static files because they don't change. Our templates here do change. They do have dynamic logic inside of them. We inject variables, we have if statements, we have loops. All of that is dynamic. Now, the CSS code we write, that's the same code all the time. It's served in the same way all the time. It's not manipulated or edited by the server. And that's why it's called static. It does not change. Having such static files is quite common, and therefore the only question now is, where do we store those files? Well, for a start, we can start with some app-specific static files. So styles specific for our challenges app, which is part of this overall project. In there, we can add a new folder next to the templates folder, not inside of it, but next to it, which should be called static. And in there, just as with the templates folder, we want to add another subfolder which repeats our app name, challenges. So it's the same structure as with the templates, just with static as a top folder. And in there, we could now add our CSS file. For example, the challenges.css file, but the file name is up to you. In there, we could now, for example, target the unordered list and set the list style to none for a start. We're going to add more stylings later. I just want to start with one so that we can see whether that has an effect or not. How do we now utilize those static files? Well, that includes a couple of steps. First of all, we should go to the settings.py file, and in there, you must make sure that in installed apps you have this django.contrib.staticfiles app. That should be there by default, and you shouldn't delete anything from there anyways, but double check that it is there. This is required for Django to load the functionality it needs to handle your static files. As a next step, you should scroll down, and somewhere you should have that static URL variable here, that static URL setting. This setting might look like it actually tells Django that it should look for static files in folders named static, but actually this setting does not fulfill this purpose or does not have this purpose. This setting instead is simply telling Django under which URL it should serve those static assets, and for the moment, that's not too important. This will become more important later once we deploy our application, but I'll talk about this setting in greater detail later in the course therefore, specifically when this becomes important and when we do need to change it maybe for deployment as mentioned. Instead, by default, Django will already look for folders named static in your app folders. So in your project, it will look into the app folders and look for static files there, and it'll automatically detect those and include those. So that's very convenient. You don't need to make Django aware of that. Here, it's set to /static/, that's the default, and that's fine. With that, we can now go to the templates where we want to use that CSS code. We can start with index.html, and then add another tag below the extends tag, and add the load tag, another tag which is built into Django. And then simply load static. Now this is not between quotes, it's just written like this. This basically loads, you could say, a plugin, some extra functionality which is now exposed in this template. You can also write your own loadable plugins, but that's beyond the course scope for now. And the static loadable plugin, so to say, is the most important plugin you need from the built-in plugins, I would say. And you need to run this in order to use static files in this template. But how do we then use those static files? Well, in case of the CSS file, we in the end want to add a link element. This typically looks something like this. Link rel equals style sheet, ref equals, and then the path to the CSS document, the CSS style sheet file. Now, this should be added, but of course, since we're in a template extending another template, we want to add that in one of the blocks, and neither the page title nor the content block is great for this. So I will go to base HTML, and here in the head section, which is where you should add those links, I'll add a new block, and I'll name this block CSS files. Of course, that name is up to you. And I'll also end that block here. And now that block is there for us to inject CSS files from other templates which inherit from this template. So back in index.html, now I want to wrap this here with block CSS files. So with this new block I just added to the base template, and also add end block. And now this gets added into this base HTML structure into our base template. But what about this link? How do we now construct this link to the CSS file? Well, because we loaded static here, we can now use another tag here, which is kind of built in, but unlike the other tags, not available by default in our templates. Instead, it's only available once we load static. And that is the static tag. We can now use that thanks to load static. Static is a bit like the URL tag. It allows us to construct a path to a static asset, so to a CSS file, for example. And for that, we now need to specify the path, and that should be between quotes. And here it's challenges/challenges.css. It's this path because we have that challenges subfolder in the static folder. And we have this subfolder, which repeats our app name, for the same reason as we had it for our templates, so that we don't have any name clashes if we have the same static file name in different apps of our project. Now, with that, Django will construct a path to this static file for us, and it will serve that static file for us, and therefore this file should be imported and the styles should be applied. Hence, if we now save all files and reload, actually nothing changes. And instead here we see we got a 404 error when the browser tried to request this challenges CSS file. It also proves, though, that this path was constructed. It points at /static/challenges CSS. But why is this failing now? Well, you simply need to restart your development server. So quit it with Ctrl+C and then restart it with Python-free manage.py run server. And if you then reload, you see now the bullet points here disappear. And now if you have a look at the network tab in the browser developer tools, you see the CSS file is loaded correctly. So that is now working as it should. But that's also a CSS file which is pretty specific to that list of challenges here. How would we add a general CSS file that should affect the entire application?